Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been sitting in the back corner of the military transport plane for the past 6 hours, her flight suit wrinkled, and her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had seen better days. The massive C-130 Hercules was packed with personnel heading to the forward operating base in Afghanistan, and the constant drone of the engines had lulled most passengers into an uncomfortable sleep. Sarah wasn't sleeping. She was thinking about the last conversation she'd had with her squadron commander before leaving Bagram Airfield. Colonel Williams had been direct, as always. "Chun, you're being reassigned to FOB Lightning. They need someone who can handle close air support missions in difficult terrain. Your record with the A-10 speaks for itself." What he hadn't mentioned was that FOB Lightning was known for its old-school mentality. It was a place where traditions ran deep and change came slowly. Sarah had heard the stories from other female pilots who had rotated through similar assignments. The questioning looks, the subtle tests, the assumption that she was there to fill a quota rather than because she had earned her place. The turbulence hit suddenly, jolting Sarah from her thoughts. The plane bounced violently, and she heard someone curse from the front of the aircraft. She looked around at her fellow passengers, a mix of Army infantry, Marines, and what appeared to be special operations personnel based on their gear and bearing. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot speaking," came the voice over the intercom. "We're experiencing some heavy weather as we approach our destination. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and prepare for a bumpy approach." Sarah tightened her harness and glanced out the small window beside her. Through the thick clouds, she could see flashes of lightning illuminating the mountainous terrain below. She had flown through worse weather, but being a passenger instead of at the controls always made her feel helpless. The plane lurched again, harder this time, and the lights flickered. Sarah noticed the special operations soldiers in the front rows exchanging looks. These were men who had seen combat, who had faced danger in its rawest forms, but even they seemed concerned about their current situation. "This is not normal turbulence," said the soldier, sitting across from her. He was tall, built like a linebacker, with the kind of tan that came from spending months in the desert sun. His uniform bore the patches of an Army Ranger battalion. Sarah nodded in agreement. She had enough flight experience to know when weather was just weather and when something more serious was happening. The way the plane was shuddering, the irregular rhythm of the engine noise, the fact that they seemed to be descending faster than normal, all of it pointed to a problem beyond simple bad weather. The intercom crackled to life again, but this time the pilot's voice was tense. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties along with the weather. We may need to divert to an alternate landing site. Flight attendants, please prepare for emergency procedures." The atmosphere in the cargo hold changed immediately. Conversation stopped, and everyone began checking their gear. Sarah felt her training kick in automatically. She might be a passenger right now, but she was still a pilot, and her mind began running through emergency scenarios. "How many flight hours do you have?" the ranger across from her asked, apparently noticing her pilot's wings. "About 800 combat hours," Sarah replied. "A-10 Thunderbolt." The soldier's eyebrows rose slightly. "Warthog pilot. Respect." He extended his hand. "Staff Sergeant Mike Torres." "Lieutenant Sarah Chun," she replied, shaking his hand. Before Torres could respond, the plane dropped suddenly, as if it had hit an air pocket. But Sarah knew better. The engines were sputtering, and she could hear the high-pitched whine of hydraulic systems working overtime. "We're going down," she said quietly to Torres. He looked at her sharply. "You sure?" "I'm sure. The pilot's trying to control a descent, but something's wrong with the aircraft. We need to be ready for a hard landing." Torres didn't question her assessment. Instead, he turned to the other soldiers nearby. "Pass it down the line. Prepare for emergency landing. Check your gear. Help anyone who needs it." The message moved through the cargo hold like a wave. Sarah watched as soldiers who had been strangers moments before began helping each other secure equipment and check safety gear. It was a reminder of why she had chosen military service, the way people came together when things got serious. The plane banked sharply to the left, and Sarah could see they were losing altitude rapidly. Through the window, the ground was getting closer, but she still couldn't make out their exact location. The mountains in this part of Afghanistan all looked similar from the air, especially in bad weather. "Can you fly one of these things?" Torres asked, gesturing toward the cockpit. Sarah shook her head. "Different aircraft entirely. But I can read instruments, understand what the pilots are dealing with up there." The truth was, she was running through every emergency procedure she knew, trying to think of anything that might help. But from the passenger compartment of a transport plane, there wasn't much she could do except prepare for impact and hope the pilots could find a safe place to set them down. The engines coughed and sputtered again, and this time they didn't recover their normal rhythm. Sarah could hear the pilots over the intercom, their voices calm but urgent as they coordinated with ground control. "FOB Lightning, this is Cargo 77. We have multiple system failures and are attempting emergency landing. Request emergency vehicles and medical personnel standing by. Cargo 77, FOB Lightning. Emergency crews are being deployed. Winds are gusting to 40 knots. Visibility is less than half a mile. Use runway 09 if possible." Sarah closed her eyes and visualized the approach to FOB Lightning. She had studied the terrain maps during her flight briefing. The base was situated in a valley surrounded by peaks, with limited approach options even in good weather. In these conditions, with a damaged aircraft, the pilots would be threading the needle. The plane shook violently as they entered another patch of turbulence. Sarah opened her eyes to see equipment shifting despite being secured. The soldier next to her was gripping his seat so hard his knuckles were white. "First time flying?" she asked him. He shook his head. "Third deployment. But I usually jump out of these things before they try to land." Despite the situation, Sarah almost smiled. Paratroopers had a different relationship with aircraft than pilots did. For them, the plane was just transportation to get them where they needed to go. For her, aircraft were partners, extensions of her will and skill. The intercom crackled again. "All personnel, prepare for emergency landing. Assume crash positions on my command." Sarah looked around the cargo hold one more time. 43 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, all depending on 2 pilots she had never met to get them safely on the ground. She said a quiet prayer for the crew in the cockpit. Knowing they were dealing with problems she could only imagine while fighting weather that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. The plane lurched again, and this time Sarah could feel they were in a steep descent. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of lights, the base perimeter, maybe, or emergency vehicles positioning themselves for their arrival. "Crash positions now," came the command over the intercom. Sarah bent forward, placing her head between her knees and wrapping her arms around her legs. Around her, 42 other people did the same. The cargo hold fell silent except for the struggling engines and the whistle of wind past the aircraft. She thought about her family back in California, about the letters she had written to her parents before deploying, but hadn't sent yet. She thought about her squadron, about the missions she still wanted to fly, about all the things she hadn't said to the people who mattered to her. The ground was coming up fast now. Sarah could feel it in the way the plane was handling, in the desperation of the engine noise, in the tension that had settled over everyone like a blanket. Then, impact. The world exploded into noise and motion. The plane hit hard, bounced once, hit again. Sarah felt her body slam against the safety harness as they skidded across what she hoped was the runway. Metal screamed against concrete, and she could smell smoke. The aircraft slid for what felt like forever before finally grinding to a stop. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of sirens. "Everyone okay?" Torres called out, his voice cutting through the silence. Voices began responding from around the cargo hold. "Yeah, good here. I'm okay." Sarah lifted her head and looked around. The plane was tilted at an angle, and some of the overhead compartments had broken open, spilling gear across the floor. But they were alive, and the aircraft wasn't on fire. "Emergency exits! People!" someone shouted from near the front. "Move it!" The rear cargo door was already being opened by the crew, and Sarah could see emergency vehicles racing toward their position. The evacuation was quick and orderly, with the most experienced soldiers helping to get everyone out safely. As Sarah stepped onto the tarmac, her legs shaky from adrenaline, she took her first look at FOB Lightning. It was smaller than Bugram, with a collection of concrete buildings and prefabricated structures scattered around the airfield. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks disappearing into the storm clouds. Lieutenant Shun, a voice called her name, and she turned to see a young Army specialist approaching with a clipboard. I'm supposed to escort you to the command center. Colonel Mason wants to see all incoming personnel for debrief. Sarah nodded, grabbed her gear bag from the pile near the aircraft, and followed the specialist across the base. The wind was still gusting, carrying dust and the smell of diesel fuel. She could hear the sound of helicopters somewhere in the distance, probably preparing for night missions. The command center was a low concrete building with blast walls around the perimeter. Inside, it was brightly lit and busy, with personnel monitoring radio communications and tracking the movement of units in the field. Sarah had been in similar facilities before, but each base had its own rhythm, its own personality. Lieutenant Shun, welcome to FOB Lightning. The voice belonged to a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s wearing the uniform of an Army colonel. I'm Colonel Masson, base commandée. Hell of a way to arrive. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I understand you're our new close air support specialist. A-10 pilot, correct? That's correct, sir. Colonel Mason studied her for a moment, and Sarah could see him forming his first impressions. She had been through this evaluation process many times before at every new assignment, with every new commanding officer. We've got a briefing in 20 minutes for all new arrivals, the colonel continued. Get settled in, grab some chow if you need it, and meet back here at 2,100 hours. Any questions? No, sir. Good. Specialist Rodriguez will show you to your quarters. Sarah followed the specialist out of the command center and across the base to a row of prefabricated buildings that served as living quarters. Her room was small but functional, with a narrow bed, a metal desk, and a locker for her gear. She had stayed in worse places. After stowing her equipment and changing into a fresh uniform, Sarah made her way to the dining facility. The food was typical military fare, but it was hot and filling. She sat alone, observing the dynamics of the base around her. FOB Lightning was clearly a tight-knit community. She could see the bonds between the personnel, the easy camaraderie that developed when people depended on each other for survival. But she could also sense the undercurrents, the subtle hierarchies, and territorial boundaries that existed in any military organization. As she finished her meal, Sarah noticed a group of men in different uniforms sitting at a corner table. Their gear was different from the regular Army personnel, more specialized and worn. Special operations, definitely, though she couldn't tell which unit from a distance. One of them, a tall man with dark hair and the bearing of someone used to command, glanced in her direction. Their eyes met briefly before he returned to his conversation with his teammates. Sarah checked her watch and realized it was almost time for the briefing. She disposed of her meal tray and made her way back to the command center, where a small group of newly arrived personnel was gathering. Colonel Mason entered the room precisely at 2,100 hours, followed by several other officers representing different branches and specialties. Sarah recognized the routine. They would each give a brief overview of their unit's mission and how the new arrivals would fit into the base's operations. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Forward Operating Base Lightning, Colonel Mason began. You're here because we need your skills and expertise to accomplish our mission in this area of operations. This is not a rear area base. We are in contact with enemy forces on a regular basis, and every one of you will play a critical role in our success. The colonel went on to outline the base's mission, the current tactical situation, and the specific challenges they faced in this mountainous region. Sarah listened carefully, filing away information about terrain, weather patterns, enemy tactics, and friendly force locations. Our close air support operations are critical to the success of ground missions in this area. The colonel continued, looking directly at Sarah. Lieutenant Shun, you'll be working closely with our special operations teams, providing air cover for missions in areas where traditional artillery support isn't available. Sarah nodded. Close air support for special ops was some of the most demanding flying in the military. The margins for error were smaller, the coordination requirements more complex, and the stakes invariably higher. After the general briefing, each of the unit representatives spoke about their specific operations. Sarah paid particular attention to the special operations briefing, given by a Navy officer who introduced himself as Commander Blake. Our teams operate in small units, often in remote areas with limited communication capabilities, Commander Blake explained. When we call for close air support, we need pilots who can work with minimal guidance, who understand the tactical situation, and who can make split-second decisions that keep our people alive. The briefing concluded with assignments for the new arrivals. Sarah was directed to report to the Flight Operations Center at 0600 hours the next morning to meet with the Air Operations Officer and begin her integration with the base's flying schedule. As the group dispersed, Sarah found herself walking across the base under a sky that was finally beginning to clear. The stars were visible between the remaining clouds, and she could see the outline of the mountains that surrounded them. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of proving herself at FOB Lightning. She knew there would be challenges, both in the air and on the ground. There always were when you were the new person, especially when you were a woman in a field still dominated by men. But tonight, she was simply grateful to be alive, to have survived the emergency landing, and to have another opportunity to do the job she loved. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. As she reached her quarters, Sarah heard the sound of helicopters taking off for night missions. Somewhere out there, other pilots were beginning their work, providing support for troops in contact, conducting surveillance, or moving personnel and supplies to remote locations. Soon, she would be part of that effort, flying her F-10 in support of missions that would test her skills and her courage. The thought both excited and sobered her. In combat flying, there was no room for error, no opportunity for second chances. Sarah entered her quarters and began preparing for the next day, knowing that her real test at FOB Lightning was just beginning. The alarm went off at 0530 hours, but Sarah was already awake, staring at the ceiling of her small quarters. She had managed only a few hours of sleep, her mind still processing the events of the previous day and anticipating what lay ahead. The Flight Operations Center was located in a hardened building near the airfield, its walls thick enough to withstand mortar attacks, and its windows replaced with blast-resistant materials. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, a habit she had developed during her training that had served her well throughout her career. Lieutenant Shun, a woman in her 30s wearing the rank insignia of an Air Force major, approached her. I'm Major Patricia Williams, Air Operations Officer. Ready to get started? Sarah followed Major Williams through a series of briefing rooms and operations centers. The facility was more sophisticated than she had expected, with multiple displays showing real-time intelligence feeds, weather data, and the positions of friendly forces throughout the region. We've got 6 aircraft assigned to this base, Major Williams explained as they walked. 4 Apache attack helicopters, 1 medevac Black Hawk, and now your A-10. You'll be our primary fixed-wing, close-air support asset. They stopped in front of a large tactical display showing the topographical map of the surrounding area. Sarah studied the terrain, noting the elevation changes, the locations of known enemy positions, and the areas where friendly forces conducted regular operations. The mountains make everything more complicated, Major Williams continued. Weather changes fast, radio communications can be spotty, and emergency landing sites are limited. Your A-10 is perfect for this environment, but it's going to test your flying skills. Sarah nodded. She had trained extensively in mountainous terrain, but training and combat were different experiences entirely. Let's go look at your aircraft, Major Williams said. They walked across the tarmac to where Sarah's A-10 Thunderbolt II was parked. The aircraft had been transported to FOB Lightning in pieces and reassembled by maintenance crews, and Sarah felt a sense of relief seeing it intact and ready for operations. The A-10 was not a beautiful aircraft in the traditional sense. It was angular and utilitarian, built around its massive Gu-8 cannon and designed to survive hits that would destroy other planes. But to Sarah, it was perfect. Every line and rivet had been designed with close air support in mind. "She's been through pre-flight checks," said Staff Sergeant Jim Morrison, the crew chief assigned to her aircraft. "All systems are green, and she's loaded with a standard combat configuration." Sarah walked around the aircraft, conducting her own visual inspection. She checked the condition of the landing gear, examined the engine intakes for foreign object damage, and verified that all external stores were properly secured. "What's the maintenance history on this bird?" she asked Sergeant Morrison. "Clean record, ma'am. She's got about 400 flight hours on the airframe, mostly from her previous assignment in Iraq. The engines were overhauled before transport here, and all major systems have been updated to current specifications." Sarah climbed up to the cockpit and settled into the familiar environment. The instrument panel was exactly as she remembered from her training aircraft, every switch and display in its proper location. She ran through her pre-flight checks, verifying that all systems were functioning correctly. "Lieutenant Chun." The voice came from below the aircraft, and Sarah looked down to see a man in Navy uniform standing near the wing root. "I'm Commander Blake. We met briefly at the briefing last night." Sarah climbed down from the cockpit. "Yes, sir. Good morning." Commander Blake was tall, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor operations. His uniform bore the insignia of Naval Special Warfare, and Sarah could see the seal trident on his chest. "I want to talk to you about how we coordinate air support," Commander Blake said. "My teams operate differently than conventional ground forces. We move fast, we work in small numbers, and we often find ourselves in situations where close air support is the difference between mission success and disaster." Sarah listened carefully as the commander explained the typical mission profile for his teams. They would insert by helicopter or on foot, conduct reconnaissance or direct action missions, and then extract using various methods depending on the tactical situation. "The key is communication," Commander Blake continued. "My forward air controller will be in direct contact with you during missions. He knows how we operate, he understands our capabilities and limitations, and he can coordinate air support with minimal radio traffic." "Who is your FAC?" Sarah asked. "Captain Jake Mitchell. He's one of my team leaders, been doing this for about 6 years. Good man, solid tactical judgment." Commander Blake paused, studying Sarah's expression. "I'm going to be straight with you, Lieutenant. Some of my men have never worked with a female pilot before. It's not that they don't think women can do the job, but they're going to be watching to see how you handle yourself under pressure." Sarah appreciated the commander's directness. "I understand, sir. I've dealt with similar situations before." "I'm sure you have. But I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, your gender is irrelevant. What matters is whether you can put ordnance on target when my teams are in contact with the enemy. Everything else is just noise." They were interrupted by the sound of helicopters approaching the base. Sarah looked up to see 2 Black Hawks coming in low from the north, their rotors beating heavily against the morning air. "That's one of my teams coming back from a mission," Commander Blake said. 3-day reconnaissance patrol in the mountains. They've been tracking enemy movement patterns along a suspected supply route. The helicopters touched down on the landing pad, and Sarah watched as the passengers disembarked. Even from a distance, she could see they were exhausted. Their movements were careful and deliberate, the way people moved when they had been operating in dangerous territory for an extended period. "Lieutenant, I'd like you to sit in on our debrief," Commander Blake said. "It'll give you a better understanding of how we operate and what kind of support we typically need." The debrief was held in a secure conference room adjacent to the operations center. Sarah sat in the back, listening as the team leader described their 3-day patrol. The information was detailed and precise, covering enemy positions, movement patterns, equipment, and probable intentions. We identified at least 2 squad-sized elements moving supplies along the ridge line, reported the team leader, a captain with the kind of beard that special operations personnel were allowed to maintain. They're using donkeys to carry equipment, which suggests they're planning to establish a cache site in the area. What kind of equipment? Commander Blake asked. Mortars, definitely. Probably 82 millimeter, based on the size of the packages. Also saw what looked like anti-aircraft weapons, possibly shoulder-fired missiles. Sarah paid particular attention to this detail. Shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles were a serious threat to her A-10, despite its reputation for survivability. Recommended response? Commander Blake asked. Airstrike on the cache site once they establish it. But we'll need close air support for overwatch during follow-up reconnaissance to assess battle damage. Commander Blake looked at Sarah. Lieutenant, thoughts on attacking a target in that terrain? Sarah studied the map display showing the area where the cache site was located. It was high mountain terrain with steep approaches and limited visibility due to the elevation. Depends on the weather and the specific target location, she replied. The A-10 can operate effectively at high altitude, but I'd want detailed intelligence on the target area and any air defense threats in the vicinity. What about close air support for troops in contact in that terrain? The team leader asked. That's more challenging, Sarah admitted. Mountain flying requires different tactics, and the margin for error is smaller. But it's definitely doable with proper coordination. Commander Blake nodded approvingly. Captain Mitchell will work with you on developing procedures for mountain close air support. We've got missions planned that will require air support in similar terrain. After the debrief, Sarah returned to the flight line to continue her aircraft familiarization. She spent the next 2 hours going through every system on the A-10, verifying that she understood how the aircraft had been configured for operations at FOB Lightning. The weapons loadout was typical for close air support missions, a mix of high explosive and armor-piercing round for the GU-8 cannon, Maverick missiles for precision strikes against hardened targets, and general-purpose bombs for area targets. Ma'am, you've got a mission briefing at 1,400 hours, Sergeant Morrison informed her. Your first combat sortie is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Sarah felt a familiar combination of excitement and apprehension. Her first mission at a new base was always significant, but this one felt particularly important given the challenges she knew she would face. She spent the rest of the morning studying maps and intelligence reports, familiarizing herself with the terrain and the current tactical situation. The mountainous environment of Afghanistan was unlike anything she had experienced during her previous deployments, and she wanted to be as prepared as possible. At lunch, Sarah found herself sitting alone again in the dining facility. She was reading through a tactical manual when someone approached her table. Mind if I sit down? Sarah looked up to see a young man wearing the rank insignia of a Navy lieutenant. He was lean and athletic with short brown hair and intelligent eyes. Please, Sarah replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. I'm Lieutenant Andy Parker, he said, extending his hand. I'm the intelligence officer for SEAL Team 3. Lieutenant Sarek Chun, A-10 pilot. I heard about your arrival yesterday. Hell of a way to get here. They talked for a few minutes about the emergency landing and the current situation at the base. Parker was articulate and well-informed, and Sarah found herself appreciating his straightforward manner. I wanted to talk to you about intelligence support for close air support missions, Parker said. We've got good real-time intelligence capabilities here, but mountain terrain creates challenges for both collection and dissemination. Parker explained how the intelligence team supported air operations, providing real-time updates on enemy positions, weather conditions, and friendly force locations. Sarah listened carefully, understanding that good intelligence could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. The enemy in this area is sophisticated, Parker continued. They understand our capabilities, and they've adapted their tactics accordingly. They use the terrain to their advantage. They've got good communication security, and they're constantly changing their patterns to avoid our surveillance. What about anti-aircraft threats? Sarah asked. Shoulder-fired missiles are definitely a concern, but they're not the only threat. The enemy has also been known to use heavy machine guns and even small-caliber mortars for air defense. They position these weapons in caves and other protected positions that are difficult to detect and engage. After lunch, Sarah attended her first mission briefing. The conference room was filled with personnel representing all the units that would be involved in the next day's operation. Special operations teams, conventional ground forces, helicopter pilots, and intelligence specialists. Commander Blake stood at the front of the room next to a large tactical display. Tomorrow's mission is a follow-up to yesterday's reconnaissance patrol. We're going to investigate the cache site that Team 2 identified and determine whether it represents a significant threat to base security. The mission profile was complex, involving multiple aircraft and ground elements. A SEAL team would be inserted by helicopter before dawn, conduct surveillance of the suspected cache site, and then either capture or destroy any enemy materials they found. Close air support will be provided by Lieutenant Shun in an A-10. Commander Blake continued, looking in Sarah's direction. Your primary role will be overwatch during the insertion and extraction phases, with secondary missions including direct fire support if the team makes contact with enemy forces. Sarah studied the route map and timeline carefully. The mission would require her to operate in mountainous terrain at high altitude, maintain communication with multiple ground elements, and be prepared to provide immediate fire support if the situation deteriorated. Weather forecast calls for marginal conditions, added Major Williams. Visibility should be adequate, but there's a chance of afternoon thunderstorms in the target area. After the briefing, Sarah remained behind to discuss specific coordination procedures with Captain Mitchell, the SEAL Forward Air Controller who would be directing her support during the mission. Captain Mitchell was a compact man in his early 30s with the kind of calm demeanor that Sarah associated with experienced combat veterans. His handshake was firm, and his eyes were steady as he studied her. I've worked with A-10 pilots before, he said without preamble. Good aircraft for what we do. Low and slow, lots of firepower, and built to take hits. What's your preferred method for target marking? Sarah asked. Depends on the situation. For precision targets, I'll use laser designation. For area targets or danger-close situations, I prefer to talk you onto the target using landmarks and grid coordinates. They spent the next hour going through various scenarios, discussing communication procedures, weapon selection criteria, and emergency protocols. Sarah was impressed by Captain Mitchell's knowledge and professionalism. One thing you need to understand about working with our teams, Captain Mitchell said as they concluded their discussion. We operate in small numbers, usually 6 to 8 men. When we call for fire support, it's because we really need it. We don't have the luxury of artillery or larger ground forces to fall back on. Understood, Sarah replied. Also, our missions often require us to operate close to civilian populations or friendly forces. You're going to be asked to make some very precise shots under difficult conditions. Sarah nodded. Danger close air support was some of the most challenging flying in combat, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. That evening, Sarah spent several hours in the flight planning room, preparing for the next day's mission. She studied satellite imagery of the target area, memorized key terrain features, and calculated fuel requirements for various mission profiles. The mountains in the target area rose to over 12,000 feet, which meant she would be operating near the service ceiling of her aircraft while carrying a full combat load. The thin air would affect both aircraft performance and weapons accuracy, factors she would need to account for during the mission. As she worked, Sarah became aware that she was being observed. She looked up to see a group of SEAL team members standing near the doorway, apparently heading to their own mission planning session. One of them, a tall man with dark hair and captain's bars on his uniform, stepped forward. Lieutenant Shun? I'm Captain Jake Mitchell. Sarah stood up, realizing this was the forward air controller she had been working with earlier. In the briefing room, she hadn't got a good look at him, but now she could see he was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of successful operations. Captain Mitchell, good to finally meet you in person. Call me Jake. We'll be working pretty closely tomorrow, so let's keep it informal. The other SEAL team members had moved on to their planning session, leaving Sarah and Jake alone in the flight planning room. I've been looking over the target area, Jake said, pointing to the map display. The terrain is going to make communications challenging. We'll probably lose radio contact during certain phases of the mission. Sarah studied the topographical map, noting the areas where line-of-sight communications would be blocked by ridgelines and peaks. What's your backup communication plan? She asked. Satellite radio, but it's not as reliable for real-time coordination. If we lose contact, I'll try to position the team where we can re-establish communications, but that's not always possible. They discussed various contingency plans, including procedures for situations where the ground team couldn't communicate with the aircraft. Sarah appreciated Jake's thoroughness and attention to detail. One more thing, Jake said as they finished their planning session. Some of my teammates are going to be watching how you handle yourself tomorrow. It's not personal, and it's not because you're a woman. We just want to make sure we can count on our air support when things get rough. Sarah looked at him directly. Captain, I've been flying combat missions for 3 years. I've supported special operations teams before, and I've never let anyone down. I don't plan to start tomorrow. Jake smiled, the first time she had seen him show any emotion. Fair enough. I look forward to working with you, Lieutenant. As Jake left the planning room, Sarah returned to her mission preparation. She had one more night to get ready for what would be her introduction to combat operations at FOB Lightning. Everything she had trained for, everything she had worked toward in her career would be tested in the mountains of Afghanistan. The mission would not just be about providing close air support for a SEAL team. It would be about proving herself to a new unit, demonstrating her capabilities under difficult conditions, and establishing the foundation for future operations. Sarah continued working until late in the evening, refining her flight plan and reviewing emergency procedures. When she finally returned to her quarters, she felt as prepared as possible for the challenges that lay ahead. Tomorrow would determine whether Lieutenant Sarah Chun would be accepted as a valuable member of the FOB Lightning team, or whether she would spend her deployment fighting to prove herself every single day. Either way, she was ready for the challenge. The alarm sounded at 0400 hours, cutting through Sarah's restless sleep like a blade. She had been awake for most of the night, her mind running through mission scenarios and contingency plans. Today would be her first combat sortie from FOB Lightning, and she knew that everything depended on how well she performed. The flight line was already busy when Sarah arrived for her pre-flight inspection. Maintenance crews were conducting final checks on her A-10, and she could see the SEAL team members loading their equipment into the insertion helicopter on the other side of the tarmac. Morning, ma'am. Sergeant Morrison greeted her. Birds ready to fly. All systems checked out during the night inspection, and your ordnance load is configured per mission requirements. Sarah walked around the aircraft, conducting her own visual inspection by the light of the floodlights that illuminated the flight line. The A-10 looked ready for war, its gray camouflage paint scheme making it almost invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. The weapons load was exactly what she had requested, a full load of 30mm ammunition for the GU, 8 cannon, 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles for precision strikes, and for 500-pound general-purpose bombs for area targets. It was a flexible loadout that would allow her to engage different types of targets as the mission required. Weather update, Lieutenant. Major Williams approached with a folder containing the latest meteorological data. Visibility is good at low altitude, but there's a cloud layer at 10,000 feet that might affect your transit to the target area. Sarah reviewed the weather information carefully. Mountain flying was challenging enough under ideal conditions, and any degradation in visibility would make her job significantly more difficult. The SEAL team is ready for insertion, Major Williams continued. They'll take off in 15 minutes, which gives you plenty of time to reach the overwatch position before they arrive at the target area. Sarah climbed into the cockpit of her A-10 and began the startup sequence. The twin engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and She felt the familiar vibration as the aircraft came to life around her. All instruments showed normal readings, and her communications equipment was functioning properly. Lightning Tower, Hawkeye 01, requesting taxi clearance for combat mission. Sarah transmitted over the radio. Hawkeye 01, Lightning Tower. Taxi to runway 09, winds light and variable. You're cleared for immediate departure upon reaching the runway. Sarah taxied her aircraft to the departure end of the runway, completed her final checks, and received clearance for takeoff. The 10 accelerated down the runway, and she pulled the aircraft into the air as the sun began to rise over the eastern mountains. Flying in the mountains was different from anything Sarah had experienced before. The terrain rose sharply from the valley floor, creating updrafts and downdrafts that made the aircraft difficult to control. She had to constantly adjust her altitude and power settings to maintain stable flight. Lightning Control, Hawkeye 01 airborne, and proceeding to area of Operations Bravo, she reported. Hawkeye 01, Lightning Control. Contact playbook on tactical frequency. Weather in your area of operations is reported clear below 10,000 feet. Sarah switched radio frequencies to contact the forward air controller who would be coordinating her mission. Playbook Hawkeye 01. Checking in with full load, 45 minutes playtime. Hawkeye 01, Playbook. Good morning. I have you radar contact. Proceed to holding area Charlie and maintain 8,000 feet. Insertion team is 15 minutes out from target area. Sarah flew to the designated holding area, a box of airspace about 5 miles from where the SEAL team would conduct their mission. From her position at 8,000 feet, she had a clear view of the target area and the surrounding terrain. The mountains stretched as far as she could see, their peaks disappearing into the morning haze. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, with steep slopes, narrow valleys, and few landmarks that could be easily identified from the air. Hawkeye 01, Playbook. Insertion team is 2 minutes from landing zone. Request you move to Overwatch Position Alpha and maintain visual contact with the insertion. Sarah flew toward the specified position, arriving just as she saw the insertion helicopter approaching the landing zone. The aircraft was flying low and fast, using the terrain to mask its approach from potential enemy observers. Tally the insertion bird, Sarah reported. I have visual contact with the landing zone. The helicopter touched down briefly in a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings. Sarah watched through her targeting system as 8 figures quickly disembarked and moved into concealment among the rocks. The helicopter departed immediately, disappearing behind the ridgeline as quickly as it had appeared. Insertion complete, came Jake Mitchell's voice over the radio. Ground team is moving toward the objective. Estimate 15 minutes to target area. Sarah maintained her orbit around the area, scanning for any signs of enemy activity. The mountains appeared empty and peaceful from her altitude, but she knew that appearances could be deceiving in this type of terrain. Hawkeye 01, be advised we have possible enemy movement 2 kilometers north of your position. Playbook transmitted. Intelligence reports at least 4 personnel moving along the ridgeline. Sarah adjusted her flight path to get a better view of the area in question. Through her targeting system, she could see several figures moving carefully along a mountain trail. They appeared to be carrying equipment, and their movement patterns suggested they were trying to avoid detection. I have visual contact with 4 personnel moving along the northern ridgeline, Sarah reported. They appear to be carrying packs and possibly weapons. Copy that. Continue monitoring, but do not engage unless directed. Ground team is approaching the cache site now. Sarah watched the enemy personnel continue their movement while simultaneously keeping track of the SEAL team's progress toward their objective. This kind of multitasking was exactly what she had trained for, but doing it in combat for the first time was more challenging than any simulation. Playbook Ground Team Leader. We have reached the cache site. Confirm intelligence reports. This is a significant weapons cache with mortars, ammunition, and what appears to be anti-aircraft missiles. Copy that. Can you destroy it in place? Negative. too much ordnance to destroy safely with our limited explosives. We're going to need an airstrike to eliminate this site. Sarah listened to the conversation while continuing to monitor the enemy personnel on the ridgeline. The situation was becoming more complex, with multiple threats and objectives to consider simultaneously. Hawkeye 01 Playbook. Ground team is requesting immediate airstrike on the cache site. Target coordinates follow. Sarah copied down the target coordinates and input them into her navigation system. The cache site was located in a narrow valley about 3 kilometers from the SEAL team's current position. I have the target coordinates loaded, Sarah reported. Request target marking for positive identification. Stand by for laser designation. Sarah watched her displays as Jake Mitchell activated his laser designator, painting the target with invisible laser energy that her aircraft could detect. A symbol appeared on her heads-up display, indicating the exact location of the target. I have laser contact, Sarah confirmed. Ready for attack run. You are cleared hot. Repeat, you are cleared hot. Use precision munitions to minimize collateral damage. Sarah selected one of her Maverick missiles and lined up for her attack run. The target was in difficult terrain, surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would make a low-altitude approach dangerous. She rolled her aircraft into a steep dive, using gravity to build up speed for the attack. The terrain rushed past her canopy as she descended toward the target, adjusting her aim point based on the laser designation. Missile away, Sarah transmitted as she fired the Maverick. The missile streaked away from her aircraft and impacted the cache site with devastating effect. Sarah could see secondary explosions as the stored ammunition detonated, sending plumes of smoke and debris high into the air. Direct hit. Jake Mitchell reported from his position. Cache site is destroyed. Outstanding shooting. But the mission wasn't over. The sound of the explosions and the column of smoke rising from the valley had undoubtedly alerted every enemy force in the area to the presence of the SEAL team. Playbook ground team leader. We have enemy forces moving toward our position from multiple directions. Request immediate extraction. Sarah looked down at the terrain around the SEAL team's position and saw what Jake was talking about. Armed figures were emerging from concealment positions throughout the area, converging on the team's location. Enemy forces approaching from the north, east, and south, Sarah reported. Count approximately 15 to 20 personnel. Hawkeye 01. Ground team is moving to extraction point Alpha. We need you to suppress enemy forces that are trying to intercept us. Sarah could see the SEAL team moving carefully down the mountainside toward a clearing where the extraction helicopter could pick them up. But several groups of enemy fighters were trying to cut off their escape route. I have visual contact with enemy forces moving to block the extraction route, Sarah reported. Request permission to engage. You are cleared to engage any enemy forces that pose a threat to the ground team. Use your best judgment on weapon selection. Sarah selected her 30mm cannon and rolled in for a strafing run against the closest group of enemy fighters. The terrain made the attack difficult, but she managed to place several bursts of cannon fire close enough to the enemy position to force them to take cover. Good hits, Jake reported. Enemy forces are taking cover. Continue suppression. Sarah pulled up from her attack run and immediately set up for another pass. This time she targeted a group of fighters who were trying to flank the SEAL team's position from the east. The A-10's cannon was devastating against personnel targets. The high-explosive rounds detonated among the rocks where the enemy fighters were positioned, sending fragments in all directions and forcing them to abandon their attack. Extraction bird is inbound. Playbook transmitted. 2 minutes out. Sarah could see the extraction helicopter approaching from the south, flying low and fast to avoid enemy fire. But there were still enemy forces between the aircraft and the SEAL team's position. I'm going to clear the landing zone, Sarah transmitted, rolling in for another attack run. This time she used one of her 500-pound bombs, dropping it on a rocky outcropping where several enemy fighters had positioned themselves with a clear view of the extraction point. The explosion sent rocks and debris cascading down the mountainside, eliminating the threat and creating a smoke screen that would help conceal the helicopter's approach. Outstanding work, Jake transmitted. Landing zone is clear. Extraction bird is touching down now. Sarah watched as the helicopter landed in the clearing and the SEAL team quickly boarded. Within seconds, the aircraft was airborne again, climbing rapidly to clear the surrounding peaks. Extraction complete, the helicopter pilot reported. All personnel accounted for. Thanks for the cover, Hawkeye. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched the helicopter disappear safely behind the mountains. Her first mission at FOB Lightning had been a complete success. She had provided effective close air support, destroyed a significant enemy weapons cache, and helped ensure the safe extraction of the SEAL team. Hawkeye 01, outstanding work today. Playbook transmitted. RTB when ready. Sarah set course for FOB Lightning, feeling the satisfaction that came from a mission well accomplished. The flight back to base gave her time to reflect on what had just happened and to process the lessons learned from her first combat sortie in mountainous terrain. The challenges had been significant, but she had met them successfully. The thin air at high altitude, the complex terrain, the multiple threats, and the need to coordinate with ground forces while engaging enemy targets. All of it had tested her skills and training to the limit. As FOB Lightning came into view, Sarah felt a sense of belonging that she hadn't experienced since arriving at the base. She had proven herself in combat, demonstrated her ability to provide effective close air support, and earned the respect of the Special Operations Forces she would be working with. Lightning Tower, Hawkeye 01 requesting landing clearance, she transmitted. Hawkeye 01, Lightning Tower. Welcome back. You're cleared to land runway 09. Winds are calm. Sarah lined up for her approach, bringing the A-10 down gently onto the runway. As she taxied back to the flight line, she could see personnel waiting for her, including several members of the SEAL team that she had supported during the mission. After shutting down the aircraft and completing her post-flight checks, Sarah climbed down from the cockpit to find Jake Mitchell waiting for her. "Hell of a job out there," he said, extending his hand. "That was some of the best close air support I've ever seen." "Thank you," Sarah replied, feeling genuinely pleased by the praise from someone whose opinion she respected. "The whole team wants to thank you," Jake continued. "You kept us alive out there, and you made sure we could complete the mission. That's what it's all about." As Sarah walked back toward the operations center for her mission debrief, she realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the new pilot trying to prove herself at FOB Lightning. She was now a combat-tested member of the team, someone who had demonstrated her abilities under fire and earned her place among the warriors who called this remote base home. The mission had been successful, but more importantly, it had established the foundation for everything that would follow. Sarah Chun was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead in the mountains of Afghanistan. The debrief session lasted for over an hour, with intelligence officers asking detailed questions about enemy positions, tactics, and equipment. Sarah provided precise information about everything she had observed during the mission, contributing to the base's understanding of enemy operations in the area. "The cache site you destroyed was larger than we expected," the intelligence officer explained. "Initial assessment suggests it contained enough weapons and ammunition to supply enemy operations for several months. Eliminating it will significantly disrupt their capabilities in this region." Commander Blake was present for the debrief, and Sarah could see his satisfaction with the mission's outcome. "Lieutenant, your performance today was exactly what we need for our operations in this area. Precision, professionalism, and the ability to adapt to changing tactical situations." After the debrief, Sarah returned to her quarters to rest and prepare for future missions. As she organized her flight gear and reviewed her notes from the day's operation, she reflected on how much had changed since her arrival at FOB Lightning just 2 days earlier. The emergency landing that had brought her to the base now seemed like a distant memory. The uncertainty and anxiety she had felt about fitting in with a new unit had been replaced by confidence and a sense of purpose. That evening in the dining facility, Sarah found herself sitting with Jake Mitchell and several other members of his SEAL team. The conversation was relaxed and informal, the kind of easy camaraderie that developed between people who had shared danger and emerged successfully. "So what's next?" Sarah asked. "Intelligence is analyzing the information we gathered today," Jake replied. "There are probably other cache sites in the area, and we're going to need to find them before the enemy can relocate their supplies. More missions like today? Similar, but each one will have its own challenges. The enemy learns from our operations, so they'll adapt their tactics and try to counter our capabilities." Sarah nodded, understanding that today's success was just the beginning of a longer campaign. The enemy wouldn't simply accept the loss of their weapons cache and abandon the area. They would regroup, adapt, and try to find new ways to threaten the base and its operations. "The important thing is that we work well together," Jake continued. "Trust and communication are everything in this kind of warfare. Today proved that we can count on each other when things get tough." As Sarah returned to her quarters that night, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction with her first day of combat operations at FOB Lightning. She had met every challenge, performed at the highest level, and earned the respect of the Special Operations Forces she would be supporting. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new challenges, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had found her place in the war effort, and she was determined to make the most of every opportunity to serve her country and protect the lives of the warriors who depended on her skills and dedication. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's first combat mission at FOB Lightning, and she had settled into the demanding rhythm of combat operations. She had flown 12 more sorties, each one presenting unique challenges and teaching her more about operating in the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. The relationship between Sarah and the special operations teams had evolved from initial skepticism to genuine mutual respect. Her precise flying and calm demeanor under pressure had earned her a reputation as one of the most reliable close air support pilots the teams had worked with. It was during the morning briefing on a Tuesday that everything changed. "We've got a situation developing," Commander Blake announced to the assembled personnel. "Intelligence has identified a high-value target in our area of operations. This individual is responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region, and we have a narrow window of opportunity to capture or eliminate him." Sarah listened carefully as the intelligence officer presented the detailed briefing. The target was a Taliban commander who had been tracked to a compound in a remote valley about 40 miles from FOB Lightning. He was scheduled to meet with other enemy leaders to plan a major offensive against coalition bases in the area. "The mission is time-sensitive," Commander Blake continued. "We have to move tonight to have any chance of success. The target will only be at this location for approximately 6 hours before moving to another safe house." The mission profile was more complex than anything Sarah had participated in before. It would involve 2 SEAL teams, multiple helicopters for insertion and extraction, and close air support from both her A-10 and 2 Apache attack helicopters. "Lieutenant Chun, you'll be providing overwatch and close air support for the primary assault team," Commander Blake explained. "Captain Mitchell will be your forward air controller, and you'll be working closely with the Apache pilots to coordinate fires." Sarah studied the target area carefully. The compound was located in a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that rose to over 14,000 feet. The approach routes were limited, and the terrain would make both the insertion and extraction extremely dangerous. "Weather forecast is marginal," Major Williams added. "There's a storm system moving into the area that could affect visibility and aircraft performance. We may have to abort if conditions deteriorate beyond acceptable limits." After the briefing, Sarah spent several hours in detailed mission planning with Jake Mitchell and the other pilots who would be participating in the operation. The complexity of the mission required precise coordination and multiple contingency plans. "This is going to be the most challenging mission we've attempted since you arrived," Jake told her during their planning session. "The target compound is in a natural fortress. There's only one approach route for the ground team, and it's going to put us in a very exposed position. Sarah studied the terrain maps and satellite imagery, tried to identify the best positions for providing fire support while maintaining her ability to maneuver if the situation went bad. "What's your biggest concern?" she asked Jake. "Anti-aircraft weapons. Intelligence suggests the target has shoulder-fired missiles and heavy machine guns positioned around the compound. We're going to be vulnerable during the insertion and extraction phases." The mission launched at 0200 hours under a cloudy sky that obscured the moon and stars. Sarah took off first, proceeding to a holding area where she would wait for the ground teams to begin their assault. Flying at night in mountainous terrain was one of the most dangerous activities in aviation. Sarah relied entirely on her instruments and night vision equipment, constantly scanning for the terrain features that could kill an unwary pilot in seconds. Lightning control, Hawkeye 01 established in holding area Alpha, standing by, she reported. Hawkeye 01, lightning control. Primary insertion is 30 minutes out. Weather in the target area is reported as marginal but acceptable. Sarah used the waiting time to review her attack plans and verify that all her weapon systems were functioning correctly. The A-10 was loaded with its standard close air support configuration, plus additional ammunition for extended operations. Hawkeye 01, this is playbook. Primary insertion is beginning approach to target area. Request you move to Overwatch position Bravo. Sarah flew toward the specified position, arriving just as she saw the navigation lights of the insertion helicopters approaching the valley. The aircraft were flying in a tight formation, using night vision goggles and terrain-following radar to navigate through the mountains. "I have visual contact with insertion formation," Sarah reported. The helicopters descended into the valley and landed near the target compound. Sarah watched through her targeting system as the SEAL teams quickly disembarked and began moving toward their objectives. For the first 15 minutes, everything went according to plan. The teams moved silently through the darkness, using their night vision equipment and careful tactics to avoid detection by enemy sentries. Then, everything went wrong at once. "Contact! Contact! We're taking fire from multiple positions." Jake's voice crackled over the radio, the sound of automatic weapons fire clearly audible in the background. Sarah immediately began scanning for the source of the enemy fire, but the darkness and terrain made it difficult to identify specific targets. Hawkeye 01, we need immediate fire support. Enemy positions on the ridge line, approximately 200 meters north of our position. Sarah rolled her aircraft toward the target area, but she couldn't clearly identify the enemy positions without risking hitting the friendly forces below. "I need target marking," Sarah transmitted. "I cannot identify enemy positions without laser designation." "Working on it," Jake replied, his voice tense. "We're pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. Enemy forces are in prepared positions with good cover." The situation deteriorated rapidly. Sarah could hear the intensity of the firefight increasing over the radio, and she knew the SEAL team was in serious trouble. "Hawkeye 01, this is Viper Flight," came a new voice over the radio. "Two Apaches inbound to your location. ETA 2 minutes." Sarah felt a measure of relief knowing that additional firepower was on the way, but 2 minutes could be an eternity in a firefight. "Got laser designation now," Jake transmitted suddenly. "Target is marked. You are cleared hot." Sarah could see the laser spot on her targeting display, indicating the enemy position on the ridgeline. She lined up for a strafing run with her 30mm cannon, but the target was dangerously close to the friendly forces. "Danger close," Sarah warned. "All friendly personnel take cover." Sarah rolled into her attack run, diving steeply toward the enemy position. The terrain rushed past her aircraft as she lined up her cannon on the laser designation point. "Guns, guns, guns," Sarah transmitted as she opened fire. The 30mm rounds impacted the ridgeline in a series of brilliant flashes, sending rock fragments and debris flying in all directions. Sarah pulled up sharply to avoid the peaks that rose above her flight path. "Direct hits," Jake reported. Enemy fire has ceased from that position. But we got more problems. Additional enemy forces are moving to surround our position. Sarah climbed to gain altitude and survey the tactical situation. Through her targeting system, she could see armed figures moving through the darkness toward the SEAL team's position. I count at least 12 enemy personnel moving from the east and south, Sarah reported. They appear to be trying to cut off your escape route. Copy that. Extraction Bird is inbound, but we need to clear the landing zone before he can get in. The Apache helicopters arrived at that moment, their distinctive silhouettes visible against the night sky. Sarah coordinated with the Apache flight leader to divide up the target areas and avoid conflicts. Viper lead, Hawkeye 01. I'll take the eastern approach route. You take the southern positions. Copy, Hawkeye. We have visual contact with enemy forces in the south. Going hot. Sarah watched as the Apaches engaged the enemy positions with their chain guns and rockets. The attack helicopters were devastating against personnel targets, but the mountainous terrain limited their maneuverability and made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Missile launch, someone shouted over the radio. Surface-to-air missile in the air. Sarah saw the flash of a shoulder-fired missile streaking toward one of the Apache helicopters. The aircraft immediately began defensive maneuvers, deploying flares and chaff while trying to evade the incoming threat. The missile missed, but its launch revealed the location of an enemy anti-aircraft position that posed a serious threat to all the aircraft in the area. I have the SAM position spotted, Sarah transmitted. Request permission to engage with precision munitions. You are clear hot, came the immediate response. Take out that SAM site. Sarah selected one of her Maverick missiles and locked onto the enemy position. The infrared seeker head detected the heat signature from a missile launcher, providing a clear target for engagement. Missile away, Sarah reported as the Maverick streaked away from her aircraft. The warhead detonated directly on target, eliminating the anti-aircraft threat and allowing the helicopters to continue their support of the ground team. Outstanding shot, the Apache flight leader transmitted. SAM threat is neutralized. The firefight continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah and the Apache helicopters providing continuous fire support, while the SEAL team fought their way to the extraction point. The enemy forces were well-equipped and determined, but they couldn't match the combined firepower of the aircraft and the tactical skill of the Special Operations troops. Extraction Bird is inbound, Jake transmitted. We need cover for the pickup. Sarah positioned her aircraft to provide overwatch as the extraction helicopter descended into the valley. The pilot was flying without lights, using night vision equipment to navigate through the mountains and avoid enemy fire. Landing zone is hot, the helicopter pilot reported, taking small arms fire from multiple directions. Sarah immediately began suppressing the enemy positions around the landing zone, using her cannon to force the enemy fighters to take cover. The Apache helicopters joined the attack, creating a wall of fire that allowed the extraction helicopter to land safely. Ground team is aboard, Jake reported. Extraction Bird is departing. Sarah watched as the helicopter climbed out of the valley, carrying the SEAL team to safety. But the mission wasn't over yet. The extraction helicopter was heavily loaded and climbing slowly, making it vulnerable to enemy fire. SAM launch, someone shouted. Missile in the air toward the Extraction Bird. Sarah saw another shoulder-fired missile streaking toward the departing helicopter. The aircraft immediately began defensive maneuvers, but the missile was tracking true. Without hesitation, Sarah dove her tin directly into the path of the missile, deploying flares and chaff to confuse the weapons guidance system. The missile, distracted by the electronic countermeasures and heat signature from Sarah's aircraft, lost its lock on the helicopter and detonated harmlessly in the distance. Negative hit. Negative hit. The helicopter pilot reported with obvious relief. Thanks for the save, Hawkeye. Sarah pulled up from her defensive maneuver and realized she had put her own aircraft at serious risk to protect the extraction helicopter. The action had been instinctive, based on her training and her commitment to protecting the people she was supporting. All aircraft, this is playbook. Mission complete. RTB when ready. The flight back to FOB Lightning gave Sarah time to process what had just happened. The mission had been successful. The high-value target had been captured along with several other important enemy personnel, but it had been the most intense combat she had ever experienced. The coordination required between multiple aircraft and ground forces, the precision needed to engage targets in close proximity to friendly forces, and the split-second decisions that had determined the outcome of the mission, all of it had tested her skills and training to their absolute limits. Hawkeye 01, Lightning Tower. Welcome back. You're cleared to land runway 09. As Sarah brought her tin down onto the runway, she could see vehicles racing toward the flight line. The SEAL team had already returned, and she could see personnel gathering to greet the aircraft as they landed. After shutting down her aircraft and completing her post-flight checks, Sarah was surprised to find Commander Blake waiting for her beside the wing. "Lieutenant, that was an exceptional performance tonight," he said as she climbed down from the cockpit. "Your actions saved lives and made the difference between mission success and potential disaster." "Thank you, sir. The team did outstanding work out there. I'm particularly impressed by your decision to intercept that missile. That took courage and quick thinking under pressure." Sarah felt a flush of pride at the commander's praise, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with her role. Tonight had demonstrated just how critical close air support could be to the survival of ground forces operating in hostile territory. The mission debrief lasted until dawn, with intelligence officers extracting every detail about enemy positions, tactics, and capabilities. The information gathered would be crucial for planning future operations in the area. "The target you helped capture tonight is one of the most important enemy leaders we've taken in this region," the intelligence officer explained. "The information he provides could lead to the disruption of enemy operations throughout Afghanistan." As Sarah finally returned to her quarters as the sun was rising over the mountains, she reflected on how much she had changed since arriving at FOB Lightning. The uncertain pilot who had crash-landed 3 weeks earlier had been replaced by a combat-tested aviator who had proven herself under the most demanding conditions. But, more importantly, she had found her place in the brotherhood of warriors who fought America's enemies in the remote mountains of Afghanistan. She was no longer trying to prove herself. She had already done that through her actions in combat. The challenges ahead would be different, but Sarah Chun was ready for whatever the enemy might throw at them next. She had earned her place among the elite Special Operations Forces at FOB Lightning, and she was determined to continue serving with the same courage and skill that had brought her to this moment. 2 months later, Sarah had become an integral part of FOB Lightning's operations. She had flown 37 combat missions, provided close air support for countless special operations teams, and earned a reputation throughout the region as one of the most skilled and reliable pilots in Afghanistan. The success of her missions had not gone unnoticed by higher headquarters, and Sarah had recently learned that she was being considered for the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the high-value target mission. But personal recognition was less important to her than the knowledge that she had found her calling in the dangerous skies above Afghanistan. It was on a quiet Thursday morning that Sarah received an unexpected summons to report to Commander Blake's office. She had no scheduled missions that day, and she wondered what the SEAL commander wanted to discuss with her. "Come in, Lieutenant," Commander Blake said when she knocked on his door. "Have a seat. We need to talk." Sarah noticed that Jake Mitchell was also present, along with Major Williams and a colonel she didn't recognize wearing the uniform of the 75th Ranger Regiment. "Lieutenant Shun, I'd like you to meet Colonel James Harrison," Commander Blake said. "He's here with a special request." Colonel Harrison stood and shook Sarah's hand. He was a tall man in his late 40s with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his career in special operations. "Lieutenant, I've been following your performance here at FOB Lightning," Colonel Harrison said. "Your reputation for precision flying and tactical judgment has reached my headquarters, and I have a proposition for you." Sarah listened carefully as Colonel Harrison explained that he commanded a joint special operations task force that conducted high-risk missions throughout Afghanistan and neighboring countries. The unit was looking for pilots who could provide close air support for missions that went beyond the scope of normal operations. These are missions that require the highest level of skill and judgment, Colonel Harrison continued. The targets are typically high-value individuals or critical infrastructure that poses a direct threat to American forces and interests. The operations are often conducted in extremely challenging environments with minimal support. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The opportunity to serve with an elite special operations unit was exactly what she had hoped for when she joined the Air Force, but she also understood that such assignments came with significant risks. "What would be required of me?" she asked. "You would be attached to my task force for a period of 6 months, operating from various forward bases throughout the region," Colonel Harrison explained. "You would work with teams from different services and international partners, providing air support for missions that often push the boundaries of what's considered possible." Commander Blake leaned forward in his chair. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that this assignment is entirely voluntary. You've already proven yourself here at Lightning, and you have nothing left to prove to anyone. But I also believe this opportunity could be exactly what you're looking for in your career." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the officers who had become her mentors and colleagues over the past few months. Jake Mitchell nodded encouragingly, and she could see the respect in his eyes. "When would this assignment begin?" she asked. "In 2 weeks," Colonel Harrison replied. "That would give you time to complete your current commitments here and prepare for the transition." Sarah thought about everything she had accomplished at FOB Lightning, about the relationships she had built and the mission she had flown. This base had become home to her in a way that no other assignment ever had. But she also thought about the opportunities that lay ahead, about the chance to serve at the highest levels of special operations, and to make an even greater contribution to the war effort. "Sir, I'm honored by the offer," Sarah said. "I accept." Colonel Harrison smiled and extended his hand again. "Welcome to Task Force Sentinel, Lieutenant. I think you're going to find this assignment very rewarding." The next 2 weeks passed quickly as Sarah prepared for her new assignment. She flew her final missions at FOB Lightning, completed the paperwork necessary for her transfer, and said goodbye to the people who had become her military family. The hardest part was saying goodbye to Jake Mitchell and the SEAL team that had been her primary partners in combat. They had developed a level of trust and coordination that was rare in military operations, and Sarah knew she would miss working with them. "You've been the best close air support pilot I've ever worked with," Jake told her during their final briefing together. "The guys in Task Force Sentinel are lucky to have you." "I learned from the best," Sarah replied. "You taught me what it means to be part of team." Major Williams organized a farewell gathering in the Officers Club on Sarah's last night at FOB Lightning. The small room was packed with personnel from every unit on the base, all of them wanting to wish her well in her new assignment. "Lieutenant Chun has set the standard for close air support operations at this base," Major Williams said during the informal ceremony. "Her professionalism, skill, and courage under fire have saved countless lives and contributed to the success of every mission she has flown." Sarah felt emotional as she looked around the room at the faces of the people who had accepted her as one of their own. When she had first arrived at FOB Lightning, she had been focused on proving herself and earning acceptance. Now she was leaving as a respected member of a community that fought together, lived together, and depended on each other for survival. "I want to thank all of you for making me a better pilot and a better officer," Sarah said when called upon to speak. "The lessons I've learned here will stay with me for the rest of my career. This base and these people will always be part of who I am." The next morning, Sarah loaded her gear into the transport aircraft that would take her to her new assignment. As the plane lifted off from FOB Lightning, she looked down at the base that had been her home for the past few months. The runways and buildings looked small from altitude, dwarfed by the massive mountains that surrounded them. But Sarah knew that the real importance of FOB Lightning wasn't measured in its physical size. It was measured in the courage and dedication of the people who served there, fighting America's enemies in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The flight to her new base took several hours, giving Sarah time to reflect on everything that had happened since her arrival in Afghanistan. She had grown from an uncertain pilot trying to prove herself into a combat-tested aviator who was sought after by the most elite units in the military. But more importantly, she had learned what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. The bond she had formed with the Special Operations Forces at FOB Lightning had taught her that military service was not just about individual achievement, but about being willing to sacrifice for the people who depended on you. Task Force Sentinel operated from a classified base that was even more remote than FOB Lightning. The facility was smaller, but more sophisticated, with advanced communications equipment and specialized aircraft that Sarah had never seen before.